started in a conference room with bad coffee and worse lighting, the kind of place where dreams go to be diluted into bullet points and buzzwords. And I was sitting across from my boss, Mark Denton, VP of Strategy at a company that called itself disruptive, but hadn't done anything new since 2014. And I knew the moment he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands with that fake mentor energy, that something was off. Because I had just finished pitching him my side project, a machine learning integration for local retail platforms that I'd been building quietly for 9 months, after hours, on weekends, using my own resources, and every line of code written by my own hand. But Mark nodded like he was absorbing it, like he was impressed, and then said something that immediately snapped the oxygen out of the room. "This is promising. Let's keep this between us for now. Between us." I should have known then. Should have seen the lie hiding behind his smile, the way he skimmed over my demo slides, how he didn't ask technical questions, only market size, acquisition cost, phrases that meant he was already imagining it in someone else's hands, namely his. Still, I gave him the benefit of the doubt, because that's what you do when you've been taught to respect authority, to be grateful for attention, to believe that maybe, finally, your work might be seen. But 2 weeks later, Mark stood at the quarterly innovation summit in front of the entire company, board members included, and presented my startup pitch, my algorithm, my design, even my placeholder brand name as a strategic internal prototype he'd personally been refining. And I sat there frozen, not because I was surprised, but because I wasn't. Because I had known. Because my gut had whispered it that day in the conference room and I had ignored it, shoved it down, replaced it with optimism. That's the thing they never warn you about. Not just the theft, but the self-betrayal that precedes it. I watched him get a standing ovation, watched the CTO lean in to shake his hand, watched my teammates glance over at me, confused, uncertain, too polite to ask the obvious. I didn't cry. I didn't leave. I clapped, quietly, and then I went back to my desk and did what I always did. My job. Because I wasn't just building a system, I was building a trap. And what Mark didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the code he presented, the platform he claimed, the very prototype that earned him that applause, it wasn't just a demo. It was laced with something else, something deliberate, something dormant, something waiting. I didn't go home that night. Not really. Just walked the city until the buzz of applause faded from my ears and the burn of humiliation settled into something colder, heavier, more dangerous. Because betrayal doesn't always feel like a knife. Sometimes it feels like a mirror cracking clean through the middle of everything you believed about loyalty, about mentorship, about merit. And by the time I got back to my apartment, back to the place where the first lines of code for my project were written in pajamas, at 2 a.m. with cheap ramen and even cheaper coffee, I wasn't heartbroken. I was done waiting. I opened my laptop and pulled up the real version of my build. Not the stripped-down clone I'd demoed for Mark, not the flashy front-end mock-up that looked like a prototype but was hollow beneath the surface. I mean the full repository, the one I had been pushing updates to under a different name, offline, with a versioning system no one at the company even knew existed, because I had learned the hard way in a previous job not to show all your cards to a man who smiles too quickly when you're talking. And it was there, nested inside the architecture of the decoy demo, that I had buried a single line of code, harmless by itself, invisible unless you knew where to look, but critical if triggered. One line that connected to an authentication script that didn't validate unless my personal key signed the request, which meant Mark had presented something he couldn't actually scale, couldn't replicate, couldn't explain, and I watched the playback of his summit presentation again, rewinding the moment where he clicked through the product flow, smiling like it was all seamless. And I smiled too, because I knew exactly what would happen when he tried to onboard clients. The login would freeze. The AI layer would fail to deploy. The predictive engine would return nonsense. And the best part? The error messages wouldn't look like sabotage. They'd look like bad code, which meant the more he pushed it, the more broken it would become, and the deeper he'd have to dig to try and understand why it didn't work, without ever suspecting that the flaw wasn't in the system, it was in him. Over the next week, Mark held meetings, talked to investors, floated timelines. I watched it all from my desk, quiet, efficient, polite, because that's the advantage of being underestimated. No one sees the fuse until the fire's already burning. And the fuse was burning slowly, silently, because this wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation, about showing him that ideas aren't just slides. They're systems. They have roots. And mine were deeper than he realized. It happened on a Monday morning, the kind that feels like a warning, overcast, still, with the kind of silence that creeps under doors before news arrives. And I was 3 sips into my coffee when I heard it, the sharp-clipped voice of Mark bouncing off the walls of the main hallway, barking questions at the dev team, demanding answers no one could give, because over the weekend he'd sent the demo build to an external partner for a closed-door trial run, and what he didn't realize, what no one could have told him without pulling apart the very thing he stole, was that the trial environment triggered the lock, and the moment they tried to replicate anything outside the local shell, the core system flagged it as unauthorized and shut down every predictive function, every dynamic rendering module, every line of AI logic I'd buried beneath the surface. I sat at my desk like I always did, head down, typing, listening. It started small. Why is the onboarding stuck? Did anyone test this on a clean environment? Then it got worse. It won't deploy the data structures. Why does the ML model return zeros? Who the hell wrote this? And that was the moment, because that question wasn't rhetorical. It was a redirect. It was Mark realizing the applause was fading and the execution didn't match the promise, and now someone had to be held accountable, someone visible, someone lower, someone like me. An invite hit my calendar for an urgent sync. No subject line, no agenda, just 15 minutes, private, in the executive glass box they called a meeting room. And when I walked in, Mark was already pacing. Andrea from legal was seated, tapping her pen, hair sat quietly in the corner like a specter. And I knew this wasn't a sync, it was a setup. Mark opened with a smile, but his eyes were frantic. "There's been some inconsistencies," he said, gesturing to a printout of error logs that looked messy but meaningless if you didn't know what you were reading. "We just need clarity." He handed me a copy. I took it slowly, eyes scanning the lines I had written months ago, lines I'd deliberately obfuscated with vague flags and generic failover conditions, because sabotage doesn't look like sabotage when it mimics incompetence. And I waited for him to accuse me outright, waited for Andrea to jump in with policy language, waited for HR to say something about team cohesion, but they didn't. Because they weren't sure, because the code wasn't broken, it just didn't trust him. I looked up and said, "Those modules weren't part of the internal repo. Looks like someone pushed unauthorized changes." Andrea blinked. Mark's face twitched. Andrea scribbled something, and I knew I'd just thrown the first grenade, because the only thing more dangerous than being underestimated was being underestimated while prepared. After that meeting, things moved fast, too fast to be normal, like a chess game played on fast forward where someone had just realized they were down 2 queens and didn't know how it happened, and I walked out of that conference room with my expression blank and my pulse steady, because what they hadn't figured out yet, what Mark was just starting to suspect, was that the project he hijacked wasn't built to run without me, not by accident, not by sloppiness, but by design, because the framework he'd stolen was a surface-level skin stretched over a back-end that required my signature, my access key, my encrypted authentication tokens for the real engine to function, and the best part? Absolutely none of that was obvious unless you went digging deep enough to expose yourself. Mark didn't want to dig, not yet, because to dig meant admitting he didn't understand it. And Mark had built his entire image on pretending to be the smartest person in the room, which meant that if he couldn't fix it quietly, someone else had to take the fall. By Wednesday, whispers had started. People and products speculated that the prototype was overhyped. Design blamed engineering. Engineering blamed integration. And someone, probably Mark, had quietly suggested that I might have submitted faulty work, that maybe I'd overpromised and underdelivered, that maybe the person who actually understood the system best had made a mistake. It would have worked too, would have landed just right, except for one thing. I wasn't scared. And when people aren't scared, they stop acting like prey. So while Mark scrambled behind the scenes, I went on offense, not loudly, not directly, but methodically. I pulled logs, detailed my development process, wrote a document that outlined the entire architecture of my original system with timestamps and metadata, and sent it to myself, to my personal email, to my backup drive, and to a friend in legal I trusted who knew exactly how to read between the lines. Then I took a breath and did something Mark never expected. I shared a cleaned-up version with two people in the company who mattered: the CTO and the head of partnerships. No accusations, no drama, just a quiet note that said, "Thought you'd want the full view of what the system was originally designed to do. Let me know if you have questions." And then I waited, not for them, from Mark, because the moment he saw that email get forwarded, the moment he realized the walls were closing in, I knew he'd reach out. Not to apologize, but to contain. And right on cue, he pinged me that evening. "Hey, can we chat real quick?" The mask was back on, the voice calm, the power dynamic shifting in real time. I replied, "Sure. Conference room B?" He said, "Actually, let's just talk here." I walked into his office, sat down, didn't blink, and let him spin. "I think there's been a miscommunication," he said. "There's some overlap between your personal prototype and what I presented, and I should have clarified that better." Overlapped like I'd accidentally left my work lying around and he'd tripped into genius. "Let's fix this," he said. "You can be part of the rollout team. Part of it, not credited, not restored, just pacified." And that's when I pulled out the USB drive, the real one, the one with the source code, the one with the metadata, the one with the security protocols that had been silently flagging every unauthorized push made since the day he cloned my GitHub repo without permission. Because yes, I'd seen that too. He reached for the drive. I pulled it back. "You can't fix what you don't own," I said. And then I stood up, walked out, and let the silence do what my voice never had, to destroy the illusion. Mark didn't come to work the next day. Not that it mattered, because by then the documents I'd shared had already circulated through the executive suite like a virus, quiet but undeniable, each slide and time-stamped commit serving as evidence that the golden pitch he'd presented wasn't just flawed, it wasn't his. And the reactions weren't explosive the way I used to imagine they might be. There was no shouting, no drama in the hallways, no mass reply-all email with a dramatic subject line, just subtle shifts in behavior that told me everything I needed to know. The CTO stopped making eye contact. The head of partnerships suddenly wanted to loop me into meetings. And my direct manager, the one who'd been mostly silent during the fallout, offered to grab coffee and talk about next steps, which we both knew wasn't about reconciliation, it was about repositioning, because once the truth started leaking out, nobody wanted to be the one standing closest to the man at the center. And Mark? He'd tried damage control. Soft, vague apologies delivered through intermediaries, an email to the tech team suggesting he'd overstepped in the excitement of the summit. A Slack message in the company-wide channel thanking the engineering team for their incredible work on the innovation prototype. No mention of me, no admission. Just erasure wrapped in corporate diplomacy. But it was too late. Because the narrative had slipped, and people talk. People notice. Developers who never liked him finally started speaking up. PMs who'd been gaslit into silence started sharing screenshots, old emails, passionary behavior, and suddenly, my situation wasn't an isolated incident. It was a case study. And while Mark tried to find new footing, I had already climbed to higher ground. Because I'd made a decision not just to expose him, but to leave, on my terms, with leverage. I started forming the LLC that weekend. Not just a portfolio site, not just a freelance page. A company mined the real product, the one with the full engine, the original code, the ethically sound architecture. I wasn't going to fight to stay where I was never protected. I was going to build something that didn't require someone else's permission to exist. And just as I filed the paperwork, just as I finalized the ownership agreement with my lawyer friend, I got the calendar invite I'd been expecting. Performance review meeting. Executive level review. It was a trap. And last desperate move to flip the power dynamic. I accepted it, walked into the room with a printed binder of every version history, every commit log, every memo and diagram, and dropped it on the table in front of them. "This," I said, "is your review?" They didn't say much. They didn't have to, because the moment the CTO saw the internal access logs, the ones showing Mark's personal login credentials accessing my private Git repository in the middle of the night, he exhaled, long and slow, and said, We'll be in touch. That night, I slept without checking my phone, and for the first time in a year, my dreams weren't about being stolen from. They were about building something that couldn't be taken. Because it was already mine. It took them 4 days to respond, not to the binder, not to the logs, not to the digital paper trail that traced every click and stolen line of code back to Mark, but to me, to the person behind the build they'd tried to rebrand as a team effort, to the architect they'd almost buried under policy and politeness. And when the email came, it wasn't addressed like an apology. It was wrapped in the kind of cold, sanitized language that only a legal team could manufacture, full of corporate vagueness and high-gloss phrases like valuable contributor, unfortunate misunderstanding, and a future we still hope to build together, as if what had happened was a clerical error, a crossed wire, something we could all chuckle about in retrospect and move on from. Never mind the theft, the silence, the gutting of a vision they didn't have the courage or capability to create. The CTO asked to meet. Just the two of us, said he wanted to clear the air. I said yes, not because I owed him closure, not because I was interested in being soothed, but because I wanted to see him squirm under the weight of everything he'd allowed, wanted to watch him try to reframe what happened as a challenge. Instead of a betrayal, wanted to sit across from him, fully intact, after they'd gambled on me being too quiet to fight. We met in a side conference room with glass walls and too many echoes. He had a tablet, a nervous smile, and a cup of espresso he didn't touch. I didn't sit first. I waited. Because I had the power now, and he knew it. He opened with praise, because of course he did. Flattery was the preferred currency of men who mistake diplomacy for decency. He called me brilliant, said I was ahead of the curve, mentioned the board was impressed with my clarity and composure, but not once did he say we were wrong. Not once did he say you were right. Then came the offer, reinstatement, a promotion, equity, but not the kind that means ownership, just the kind that buys compliance. Stock options, vague promises, a seat at the table that came with no voice, no vote, and no veto. He said, think about what we could do together. And I looked at him, really looked at him, at the careful suit, the curated humility, the practiced neutrality of a man who wanted me back not because he respected me, but because I had become too inconvenient to keep outside the circle, and I asked, why would I stay? He blinked like I'd spoken in a language he hadn't prepared for, because they always prepare for negotiation, for resistance, for needing to dangle more money or title or access, but not for clarity. I kept going. Why would I stay at a company that protects liars, rewards theft, silences builders, and only values innovation once it's been repackaged by someone with a better title and a louder voice? He didn't answer. Didn't even try. Because the truth doesn't need your permission to exist. It just needs a crack in the facade to flood through. So I stood, took my folder, my laptop, my piece, and I walked out with the kind of calm that only comes when you finally realize that the door behind you doesn't lead to anything you want anymore. 2 hours later, I submitted my formal resignation. Attached to it was a single line. I appreciate the opportunity, but I've decided to invest my time in building something that doesn't need to steal to succeed. And then I went home, lit a candle, got my laptop, and quietly launched the pre-registration page for my platform, Mine Landed Undaleable, built from scratch by someone they thought would never leave because she had always stayed within the hour. The first email hit my inbox. An angel investor who'd seen my original prototype through a mutual contact and wanted to talk. Serious tone, clean terms. The second came from a developer I had mentored 2 years ago, someone who'd sat in the back of the room taking notes while others postured. She said she wanted in. The third was a message from someone in press. Rumor is you're building something big. Can we talk? And I was, because while they were busy trying to buy my silence, I had already sold myself something better. Freedom. The kind of freedom that comes not from revenge, but from reclaiming what was always yours to begin with. The week after I resigned was quiet in the way only aftermaths can be. Still air, long mornings, inbox pings that weren't urgent but curious, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask you to shrink, just breathe. A silence that doesn't feel empty but earned, like the house after a storm, when the windows stop rattling and everything fragile has already fallen, and it was in that space, between one email and the next, that I realized something painfully simple and quietly profound. They never thought I'd leave, not really, not completely, not without a fight or a plea or a parting performance of gratitude. Because people like me, the steady ones, the smart ones, the ones who do the actual labor while others stand in the spotlight, were conditioned to stay, taught to internalize praise crumbs like their cake, told to be honored by table scraps while someone else carves their name into our work. But I didn't stay. I left. With no tantrum, no dramatic exit, no final scene to make them feel important, I just walked. And that decision rippled through the walls like a fault line, finally breaking tension because Mark resigned 2 days later. Quietly, of course. Professionally. The kind of resignation that isn't really a resignation but a corporate PR sleight of hand, rewritten in memos as a strategic leadership transition that everyone in the company pretended to believe because acknowledging the real reason would mean admitting they'd known all along and done nothing. He wasn't fired, he was erased, but the damage remained. By the time his exit email landed in inboxes, the version of the product he'd stolen was a ruin, useless code that had never been real, a framework that collapsed under its own fraudulence. And every time someone tried to salvage it, they only found more of what I had left behind. Empty shells, locked modules, and integrations that wouldn't cooperate because they weren't meant to unless I said they could. And the team? They started reaching out, quietly pulling by one. No public posts, no grand acknowledgments, just private messages that said everything their silence hadn't. Let's catch up. Sorry that happened. You were always the one making it work. There were no apologies from the top, no official recognition of what I'd endured, but I didn't need it. Because I hadn't walked away expecting closure. I'd walked away expecting air. And now I could finally breathe. The platform I launched on my own had begun to gain traction. Not with headlines or hype, but with users, with honest feedback, with emails that said this solved something we didn't even realize was a problem. And that, more than funding, more than applause, was the thing that mattered. Being seen for what I actually built, not who stood in front of it while I sat behind a keyboard making it real. And the best part? I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of being overlooked. Not of being underestimated. Not of watching someone else take my work and call it theirs because I had already lived through that fire. And come out sharper. I had learned how to embed integrity so deeply into my systems that it couldn't be separated from the architecture. I had learned how to watermark my innovation in ways they couldn't trace but couldn't replicate either. I had learned how to build traps that didn't punish, they revealed. And they did. Again and again, and because code tells the truth in silence, because trust, once broken, doesn't come back. It gets replaced. And on a Friday evening, just as the city started to buzz and the sky leaned into its golden hour and the air filled with that soft hum of new beginnings, I got one last message. Graham Mark shored him line. Was it you? And I smiled, didn't reply, because if he had to ask, he already knew. 3 months later, I walked into the kind of meeting that used to make me anxious. Clean conference table, notepads perfectly aligned, glasses of water already sweating against the wood, the air sharp with the quiet hum of power. But this time, I wasn't there as support staff. Not a second seat to someone else's pitch, not the technical brain hiding behind a smoother mouth. I was the reason the meeting existed, the founder, the architect, the name on the deck, the signature on the IP, the one who had walked through fire and come out sharper, steadier, not burned, just forged. And across from me sat 3 people in suits I never thought I'd meet this early in the game, each one representing firms that had once skimmed over my name on a funding application, dismissing me as not ready, too early stage, or the worst one, needs more leadership experience, all while Mark had been packaging my innovation as his own and grinning through stolen pitch decks like he'd done more than plagiarize brilliance he couldn't even begin to build. Now they were leaning in. Now they were listening, because now they knew. They'd seen the headlines, heard the internal memos, sat through conference panels where people whispered about the AI founder who walked away from a hijacked project and built something better in half the time. And they weren't just interested. They were eager, attentive, reverent in that way investors get when they realize the power dynamic has quietly shifted and the person they overlooked now holds the thing they desperately want to be part of. And I didn't gloat. I didn't rub it in, because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about permanence. It was about clarity. It was about redefining who gets to build the future and who gets left behind trying to explain how they missed it. The platform had scaled. What started as a prototype buried beneath corporate silence had blossomed into a full suite of adaptive systems solving real problems for real people, with integrations running smoother than projected and churn rates lower than anything my competitors could brag about. The pilot partners weren't just renewing. They were advocating, putting my name in rooms I hadn't even asked to be in. And the numbers? Yes, the numbers were good. But better than the metrics was the shift, the word people started using when they talked about me. Not promising, not survivor, but proven. The founder. The one who'd outthought, outbuilt, and outlasted. And Mark? I didn't know where he was. Didn't care because he wasn't in this room. He wasn't on this call. He wasn't listed on any cap table or credited on any slide. He wasn't part of the conversation because I had rewritten it without him. And as the meeting wrapped, as one investor slid the term sheet across the table like it was ceremonial, like they were late to something inevitable, I didn't smile for them. I smiled for me, because this wasn't a gift. It wasn't approval, it wasn't redemption, it was recognition. It was what happens when the person you underestimated stops trying to be understood and starts being undeniable. And that night, I stood on my balcony, glass of champagne in hand, phone off, inbox closed, the city wide and waiting below me, and I whispered it out loud, not for them, but for me. You never owned me. You just borrowed my brilliance until I took it back. Because that's what the trap had always been. Not revenge, not sabotage, but truth code built to collapse under the weight of a lie. A system that didn't fail, it revealed. A map that only the original architect could read. And now I didn't just have the original, I had something better, proof that the quiet one doesn't just survive the theft, she reclaims the blueprint and rebuilds the entire damn skyline.